Thank you, Joe, and for inviting me to present this morning. And thank you all for attending in person, and thank you all for attending online. I am a partner at Vedder Price here in Chicago, and I chair our data privacy and information governance practice. For the last 15 plus years, we have been helping companies and public entities with their information governance programs. Everything from developing records retention schedules to defensible disposition of obsolete records to privacy issues, and one of the things that has come up quite a bit in terms of responding to the unfortunate events of a data breach. In fact, I'm kind of currently in the process of helping a county here in Illinois completely revamp their information governance processes, including developing policies and procedures around to dispose of their records in accordance with the Local Records Act. And I was talking to Joe when the topic first came up, how timely this topic of information records management is today, right? So, as Joe mentioned, it's a topic that's it's been an unfortunate topic that we've all had to deal with for a very long time, but particularly now it's important because of all the recent data breaches. Let me explain, right? So, unfortunately, public entities and private companies have not done a very good job with records management, information governance. And as a result, information continues to accumulate. That haystack keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And in the past, what has happened is, although it may have been inconvenient at times to try to find that needle in the haystack, and sometimes impossible, you also had increased costs of maybe, spending a few extra dollars with Iron Mountain or some additional money in terms of electronic storage. But on the whole, folks kind of did the analysis and thought, well, there's not a whole lot of return on investment in terms of getting rid of our records. That's changed, right? 2004 was the year of the data breach. And I think folks are really understanding that there is an inherent risk of retaining those records for a long period of time for two reasons. Number one is it exposes those records to being compromised. And then if you do have a breach, I should take a step back. When you have a breach, the amount of information that is compromised could be significantly larger. Don't get me wrong, public entities, libraries, every entity is subject to a data breach, right? Whether it's hackers, they're looking for you guys too. Unfortunately, you may have lost or stolen unencrypted laptops that may have sensitive data. So there's a whole host of reasons or whole host of avenues or venues that you can have information compromised, underscoring the fact of how important it is to have good records management and how important it is to dispose of records in accordance with the Local Records Act. Let me give you an example. We were working with a public university out on the East Coast, and they had received thousands and thousands and thousands of employment applications. And by law, they are required to keep those employment applications for rejected employees that they didn't hire for 2 years. Unfortunately, though, they kept those applications that had, going back, Social Security numbers and a lot of sensitive information in excess of 12 years. Unfortunately, one of their employees got hit with a phishing attack, right? So basically one of their employees opened up an email and a link to a site that they thought was legitimate. That allowed some malware to get into their system and eventually to get into the database that maintained those employment applications. So rather than having a breach, and they would have had a breach that would have been 2 years worth of employee applications, they now were dealing with 12 years of employee applications. So the amount of people that they had to notify was more than tenfold. In addition to the fact of it really affected the public trust in kind of their name and their brand. So let me just say this. I've carved out, here's the agenda for today, and carved out some time for Q&A. I'm sorry, I'm not the most engaging speaker, so if you've got any questions throughout the presentation, please stop, ask for those folks here in the room or those folks online. Otherwise, if you're listening to me for 90 minutes on an exciting topic of records management, you might kind of fall asleep. So please stop and ask me any questions. Be happy to field them. So in terms of, for the agenda for this morning, we're going to talk about what is the Local Records Act, right? The entities that are subject to the Local Records Act. What's a public record? We'll also talk a little bit about retention obligations in terms of, can we scan those hard copy records and maintain those electronic records electronically and then get rid of them? How do we deal with emails and other forms of electronic information? And then talk about the process, kind of nuts and bolts of developing a retention schedule, finally applications for disposal records and getting those certifications and actually getting rid of those records. And again, I'm going to carve out a little bit of time for questions and answers. Okay? Any questions, comments so far? Okay. And not to give you the Genesis version, but I think it's important to understand kind of where we're at and how we got here. So before the Local Records Act was enacted, there was a lot of lack of uniformity in terms of how long public entities retained and how they retained their records. And basically, because each of the officials for each of the units of government basically decided how long and how they were going to keep records, and those officials change pretty regularly, you have a lot of discontinuity in terms of how public records were maintained, what public records were retained, how they were retained, and how long they were retained. The problems were pretty obvious, especially in terms of the legal considerations, public access, and also kind of historical value of what will we consider historical and how long we wanted to retain those records. So fast forward to the Local Records Act. The Local Records Act requires local governments and their agencies to retain public records and provides the procedures by which those public bodies may obtain authority to dispose obsolete public records. Now, a lot of people assume that the Local Public Records Act has retention periods in those. It doesn't. Rather, there are a number of federal and state laws and regulations that define how long certain types of records are to be retained. But the Local Records Act itself does not contain any specific retention periods. Instead, it provides a framework of how records should be maintained and how those records can be disposed of, and approval for those dispositions in accordance with the retention period set forth in other federal and state regulations. So to give you an example, right, in terms of employment applications, by federal law, those applications are to be retained for 2 years. That's where the retention period comes in, not necessarily the Local Records Act. Also, it applies to agencies, right? So the agency is broadly defined as any parts, boards, departments, bureaus, commissions of any county, municipal corporation, or political subdivision. Pretty broad. So for our purposes, it includes library districts, other special districts, county agencies, municipalities, townships, school districts. Basically, any kind of public library would be included within the coverage of the Local Records Act. So what is a public record? Well, the Act defines a public record very broadly, and it provides some specific examples of what is a public record. So number one, could be a book, could be a paper, could be a map, could be a photograph. It also includes digitized electronic materials. So those are kind of the specific examples. And then it has a catch-all, any other official documentary material. So it lists those as what is kind of the examples of what is a public record, and then it also provides some additional definition or additional criteria to that definition, and that is it's a public record regardless of the physical form or characteristic. And prior to the start of our presentation today, I was having some discussions with the folks here about electronic records. So, really, if you're dealing with kind of a paper, piece of correspondence, that may be a public record, whether it's in hard copy or whether it's in electronic form. Further on with that definition, it must be made, produced, or executed, or received by an officer pursuant to law, or in connection with the transaction of public business. All right? Preserved or appropriate for the preservation of such agency or officer, or any successor thereto. So the thought is not just now in time, but also in the future, as evidence of the organization, function, policies, decisions, procedures, or other activities thereof, because of the informational data contained therein. Focus on that last part, right? So basically, public records that fall within the Local Records Act are basically anything that you're going to generate or receive as part of your activities or the library's activities in performing services to the public. Whether it's both internally, internal memos, internal correspondence, or external communications or external documents. It's very broad, as you can imagine, right? I think the thought is, and this is what I kind of tell our folks, if you kind of think it may be a public record, may not be a public record, it's probably better to err on the side of it considering a public record. There are certain statutory exceptions of what is not a public record, and there are a couple of them that particularly are applicable to libraries, okay? So the first of which is library materials made or acquired and preserved solely for reference or exhibit purposes. That's not a public record. So any kind of the books that you're accumulating, or talking to Joe, any kind of those e-books you're accumulating, also not a public record. Extra copies of documents preserved only for convenience or reference, right? So if you've got duplicative or convenience copies of correspondence or other records, point being there is there's one kind of official public record, and then also the duplicates of those do not fall within the definition of a public record. That's important for a number of reasons that we'll talk about with regard to the disposition of those records. A couple other thoughts. There's another exception that applies to public records, and that exception involves registration records defined under the Library Records Confidentiality Act. Those are also not public records. And the Library Confidentiality Act provides that registration records of a library are confidential information, and that no person shall publish or make any information contained in those records available unless, one, they're required to do so by court order, or essentially by a law enforcement person as a result of an emergency that there's an immediate danger to physical harm. The Library Records Confidentiality Act definition of registration records, again, is important because it ties into the fact that those records are not public records. Defines registration records as any information that a library requires a person to provide in order for that person to become eligible to borrow books or other materials. So therefore, the Local Records Act states that the registration records are not considered public records once the information contained in the paper registration records is transferred to a secure electronic format and checked for accuracy. All right? So, kind of put this in context, an example of a non-record are kind of the books, the magazines, and papers that is part of the library's collection. Those are not public records. But with regard to things like computer sign-in sheets, book checkout records, correspondence with vendors, contracts, kind of everything else, those are considered public records, and those must be maintained and disposed of in accordance with the retention periods that are set by the Local Records Commission that we'll talk about a little bit later. Keep in mind one thing before we get done here in terms of confidentiality under the Library Records Confidentiality Act. Don't confuse confidentiality with retention. They're two different things and different requirements. A lot of overlap, but they are not one and of the same.
I have a question on that last bullet point.
Sure.
Paper copies are not a public record, but once you transfer them into an electronic version, then they are.
Yeah, so the question was, with regard to paper records, if they are a public record, but once you transfer them into electronic, then they are not. So, so a difference, right? So with regard to registration records, the answer to that is yes, right? So basically once registration records are transferred into electronic records, then those are not public records. But in terms of any other kind of record, whether hard copy or electronic record, it really goes to the content of that record, and based upon the content of that record, if it meets the definition of what is a public record, it will be a public record whether it's in hard copy or electronic. This exception to the Public Records Act is a little bit unique, and sorry for not being completely unclear, but it's just the transfer from hard copy to electronic only deals with registration records under the Library Records Confidentiality Act. Does that answer your question? Okay, terrific. All right. Which is a terrific segue for the next slide, right? So in terms of what is a public record versus a non-record, a lot of times we get this question all the time, right? The question is, are videos, faxes, email, instant messages, are those considered public records? The answer to that really, again, depends upon the content of the record. So if the information within the video, right, if the information in the email or the instant message, if it meets the definition of a public record, right, here, then it very well may be, in fact, a public record, regardless of whether it's in a video, email, or instant message. It's likely that you're receiving far more emails as part of your duties in carrying out the business of the library and meeting your constituents' needs than what you are in terms of correspondence, hard copy correspondence. So those emails, again, if they meet the definition of a public record, those must be considered as a public record and are to be retained and disposed of in accordance with your applications that we'll get to later. Also, you may have an email if you're negotiating with the vendor, right, about a contract or contractual terms. Those emails really are part of the overall contract documents as opposed to general just correspondence, and probably should be retained with your vendor agreements or with your contract files. Similarly, you may have an email in which a supervisor may be instructing one of his or her subordinates to do a task. And how that subordinate performs that task may be important in terms of evaluating and disciplining that employee. So again, that email would be a public records and needs to be retained as part of the overall personnel records in your schedule and application. Any other questions so far? All right, terrific. What about Facebook? Twitter, blog, MySpace, some of the other social media sites. I think obviously Rails has a website. I know my public library in Glen Ellen has a website. You guys, do you have blogs or?
We have one blog, our website, Facebook, Twitter, all of it.
Yeah, so Joe was saying that you have all the different types of social media to get your message out to the library, and also guys like me who use the public libraries. So long story short, are those a public records? They very well may be. And again, depending upon the content of that information sitting in those blogs or Facebook sites, they could be. And because they are public records, they can only be deleted if they are listed on an application for authority to dispose of public records, and then once the certificate, local records disposal certificate has been approved by the local records commissioner. Stop for just a minute and think about what that means, right? So if you think about, we are posting public records on our website, it raises a whole number of different issues as to how we are maintaining those records in terms of, that's constantly evolving. If you post something on a website today, how are we capturing that post or that content in our website? How are we maintaining that information, right, electronically or what have you? And then how are we providing authority to get rid of that? It seems like a somewhat easy question, but there are a lot of knotty issues in terms of the actual implementation of what this means, right? So we've kind of talked that the libraries are subject to the Local Records Act. We talked about generally what is a public record, and some exceptions, what are non-records and what have you. And so given the fact that we have to maintain potentially a large volume of records, of local records, one of the issues that always comes up in talking to folks like you is, can we scan our public records? And the answer to that is yes. And also then becomes okay, can we scan those records and what do we do with the original? So let me pause for just a minute. So fortunately, the Local Records Act kind of finally, it only took us until 2001 in Illinois to finally kind of the law to catch up with technology, but the Local Records Act was finally amended to allow existing public records to be transferred into digitized electronic formats and then to dispose of the original public records. Now, in terms of kind of what is the digitized electronic format, the Local Records Act doesn't specifically say you must use this type of system or this type of application. Rather, it kind of sets some broad general guidelines that you need in order to maintain those records. And the thought really is, if you kind of take a step back, is maintaining those records not just for today, but also potentially for historical value. So if we're going to move these from hard copy, out of the archives, hard copy records out of the archives that for the most part probably, wouldn't degrade, and moving into those systems that we may need to keep electronically for a very long period of time, the law says it needs to be a durable medium that accurately and legibly can reproduce the original in all details. That's one thing. Two is that does not permit additions, deletions, or changes to the original document. So you've got to preserve the integrity of that original record. Here's the other thing that the law doesn't specifically require, right? But you got to give some thought to it, right? Technology is constantly changing, right? So many times we have information sitting on obsolete systems that either we no longer support or we no longer have the license So, if you do move to digitized records, give some thought as to what are we going to do for tomorrow or 10 years from now or 15 years from now, right? How are we going to get access to those records if we need it? Do we need to keep, applications online? Do we need to maintain those licenses? So, much bigger picture, more problems than just kind of, hey, can we scan these records? So, once we scan the records, what do we do with the hard copy originals, right? Can we dispose of those? And the answer to that is yes. And if you think about this, it requires kind of a two-step process. So if you decide to go ahead and scan, let's say, a payroll application and move the payroll application and maintain it only in electronic form, with regard to the hard copy record, you need to go out and get authority to dispose of the hard copy record after you scan the record. And then the electronic version needs to be maintained for the required retention period. So for instance, like for 2 years. And once that retention period has expired, then you need to get authority approval from the local records commission to dispose of the electronic records, kind of a two-step process. Pause for just a moment. And this is kind of a hard lesson learned. We've handled a number of different entities do scanning projects, okay? And again, this is hard lesson learned. So as you're going through and scanning the records, Q&A, or quality control is absolutely critical. Let me give you, this wasn't a public records, but let me give you kind of some flavor. So we had a large retailer that decided that they were going to get their employment records from all of their stores across the U.S., move it into one central place, scan those records, and maintain those records electronically. So far, so good. Unfortunately, as they were scanning the records, they were taking their employment files, scanning them, and tossing them to a bin, okay? This is a huge, huge retailer. So they had tens of thousands of employment files in one bin. They were all mixed up. They were not maintained, just in these huge bins. When they were almost finished with the scanning project, they decided, hey, let's go and look and see what the electronic files were. Unfortunately, they were having quality issues in which records were not placed in the right files, things were mis-scanned, misplaced, what have you. So basically they had to, well, essentially they couldn't, recreate those employee files. They had electronic files that were incomplete, inaccurate, or just missing stuff. So if you go ahead and do this project, lesson learned is to go ahead and do your scanning, do some sort of quality check, whether kind of in general, pull out some of the files that you're scanning, just make sure that it's working, that you're filing them in the right place, and then only after that, then get rid of the hard copy records, but keep the originals kind of in their same form until you do some quality checks. One other point before moving on here, and that is, again, so any information that was a public record, and this kind of goes to your question, when in paper, remains a public record when it's transferred and maintained in electronic digital format. And then any public record, once it is moved into electronic format, that electronic record must be maintained for the applicable retention period. Any questions so far? Okay. So disposition of public records. And this is kind of the meat of the Local Records Act in terms of how do we get rid of those public records. I'm sure a lot of you, like any public entity that I've worked with, has accumulated vast quantities of public records, right? Public records, non-records, and everything else. We were working, and again, this is not Illinois-centric, but we were working with a state out on the East Coast. when we started developing their overall information governance program, and to a large measure, our task was to dispose of their obsolete legacy records that they had accumulated over many, many years. And as we were going down and talking to the folks, we had did a kind of a tour of their hard copy records. And if you remember kind of that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark with that huge warehouse of different types of boxes, well, when we went and viewed one of their record storage facilities, it was a lot like that, right? So the one thing that they had a problem with is because they had accumulated such a large volume of hard copy records and also electronic records, the information that they wanted to keep and wanted to get access to, they couldn't find. As truly it was a needle in a haystack that they had great difficulty in finding. So not only are you, by going through the process of disposing of records in accordance with the Local Records Act, are you reducing your risk of a data breach, but also making you all more efficient in terms of finding the information you want, calling the wheat from the chaff. And then heavens forbid if you are ever involved in litigation. So if a litigation adversary is asking you for records, you have to produce the records that you have. And the larger volume of records that you have, the larger volumes of information that your attorney has to review and produce to the other side. And if you can reduce that volume, you can save a lot of money. And quite frankly, dirty little secret, if you are in litigation, what do you think the largest cost in terms of document production? Is it finding the records? Is it, either printing those out in hard copy records from electronic, having the attorneys review it, or producing it to the other side? What do you think is probably the largest cost of those? Finding? Yeah, that's a significant cost. The largest cost of that is the attorney review, right? So a lot of attorneys may not tell you, hey, get rid of this stuff, because there is a self-interest. I will tell you, the more you can get rid of, the better off you are. So let's talk about disposition of public records. Local Records Act says that all public records made or received coming into the custody, control, or possession of any officer or agent shall not be destroyed except as provided by law. It further says that no public record shall be disposed of by any officer or any agency, again, that would include libraries and library districts, unless written approval of the appropriate local records commission is first obtained. And then it's got a little teeth to it. If you don't follow the law, you may be subject to, you may be guilty of a class 4 felony. I'm not a criminal lawyer, but I don't know what that means, but that just doesn't sound real good to me. So I don't know what the fines and penalties of that. Just know that's something you probably want to avoid. Okay? Now, interesting, we talked about some of those non-records. So that includes convenience copies. We were talking about some of the other non-records, things that don't meet that statutory definition of a non-record. Now, the Public Records Act says, with regard to non-record materials, those can be disposed of at any time by the agency, by the library, without prior approval of the Local Records Commission. So, if you've got convenience copies or you have other things that don't meet the definition of a local records or local records, you can get rid of them. Stop for just a minute, though, and again, given kind of tying this into what the observation I made earlier, and that is those records, although those may not constitute a non-record. So, for instance, we may have duplicative employment applications. We may have duplicative payroll records. We may have duplicative circulation records. We can get rid of those, obviously, but let's take care of how we go out and get rid of those. Let's not stick those in a dumpster where they may be subject to somebody doing some dumpster diving, and then therefore we've got a data breach. So be very careful in terms of of how you get rid of those records. Even though you can get rid of them at any time without approval of the local records commission, make sure you're doing it in a secure way. And to that point, also training on this is a very important part of this. Train your folks to understand the sensitivity of those records and how that those may be compromised, and provide shreddings or secured sites or secured receptacles, disposal receptacles, so that folks can put those sensitive records in and those are taken care of. So far, so good? Okay. So really, the steps for disposition, proper disposition of public records, it's a four-step process. First off, you need to conduct a records inventory of all the public records that you're generating or creating or receiving in the ordinary course of conducting your business as a library. Based upon that records inventory, you need to develop a retention schedule. And you'll use that retention schedule to submit your application for authority to dispose of local records to the Local Records Commission. Let me just pause there for a second. So basically there are essentially two commissions. There is a Local Records Commission for Cook County, and there's a Local Records Commission for everybody outside of Cook County. And depending upon where you're located, you will submit your application and your certificate to that Local Records Commission, Cook County or everybody else. The one for everybody else is down in Springfield in the lovely Norton building. So after you, so the application generally, kind of give a step back, the application is a general records retention schedule. Like, here are our records and here's how long we're going to keep those records. The second part is once we have identified certain records that are subject to disposition in accordance with that retention schedule, that application, then we need to go to the commission and say, okay, this specific record is now subject to disposition, let's get rid of it. So if you think about it, kind of my employment application example is, you may decide, hey, we've got employment applications. We know at a minimum we need to keep those employment applications for 2 years. There may be other valid business reasons that we decide ourselves that we want to keep those employment applications for 5 years. So we now make the decision, we want to keep those employment applications for 5 years. We submit, we list employment applications with a recommended retention period for 5 years to the Local Records Commission. They take that, they approve that retention period. So that is our retention period for employment applications. So now we've got employment applications going from 2000 to 2010. So then we identify those specific employment applications, 2000 to 2010, to the Local Records Commission, say these records are now subject to disposition. Please approve of that disposition. They will approve it, and then you dispose of it. It's kind of a multi-step processes. I know it's a lot of work, but if we don't, all right, there's some consequences to it. Any questions with regard to kind of the overall step? All right. So step number one is conduct a records inventory. Has anybody done this? I think you guys, I think Rails may be in the process of doing that as well.
Myself personally, no.
Yeah.
Somebody on staff,
Yeah. So really the first step is to conduct a records inventory. And really what that is going through to the various departments, whether it's HR, whether it's circulation, whether it's vendor management, whether it's whatever, and going out to each one of those departments and asking them, look, what records are we currently generating, right? Either what records are we generating, what records are we receiving, and how long are we keeping those? The other thing too is, because for a lot of you, who may not have disposed of records for a very long period of time, the next thing you want to find out is not only what records are we creating today, but what records have we created in the past, and what records are sitting out in Iron Mountain, and what records are sitting out on some of our legacy servers and other electronic records repositories. Kind of a two-step process. And really what you're doing is, again, the point of doing this is coming up with that retention schedule, right? So what records do we have, and how long are we keeping those? And we'll take that records retention schedule and we'll use it for our application to submit to the local records authority. So given what we're trying to accomplish, there's a couple different elements that we need to find out. Number one, what's the name? What's the title of the record, of the public record? Two is, what is the earliest date of that record? So do we have employment applications going back to 2010? Do we have employment applications going back to 1998 or sometime before then? May seem like, so what, but for you all, and actually it is a useful piece of information for you to find out, is because once you do the applications, then you can go back and start getting rid of those things, and this is a good time to figure out how long we have those records going back so we can kind of become current. The volume of those records, right? So totally, what is the volume of that particular record? And I'll kind of talk about how to figure out or give an estimate of that. That's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, just to let you know, hey, do we have a large volume of hard copy records? Is that continuing to be large volumes of records? We may, decide to either scan those records if we know we got a large volume of records. If we decide not to, that could help you do kind of some space planning. Or also, if you got a large volume of particular type of records that you're sending off-site on a fairly regular basis, that's something that you can use to maybe negotiate with the Iron Mountains of the world to get a better deal on your hard copy record storage. What's the annual accumulation, right? So is this something that we've had a lot of 10 years ago, or there's very little of those records now? Also important to know. And then what's the arrangement? Is it by, in chronological order? Is it by alphabetical, alphanumerical order, or some other kind of combination of how we're maintaining these records, right? So if you think about employment applications or employment files, those may be maintained in a couple different ways, right? So any employment applications that were submitted in 2015 that were rejected, those might be filed by year, and then within that year, alphabetically or some other system. And then also kind of the recommended retention period. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, what goes into what that means. Okay. And as Joe mentioned, this is a Herculean task. It really is. I mean, it requires a considerable amount of resources, both in terms of money and also in terms of time. And this is not something that you're going to do immediately. I would highly recommend that if you are doing this process, it's a greenfield. If we're starting off from the very beginning, you need to have somebody dedicated to managing this overall process and to oversee and to also drive this process. Because what's going to happen is you're going to go out and reach out to the different departments, and as much as it hurts my heart, records management may not be on the top of everyone's list, top of everyone's priority. So, it gets oftentimes pushed back to the back burner, and you're going to need to be somebody who is going to be constantly reaching out to folks to get them to help you through the records inventory process. Here's also, and this is kind of a shameless plug, right? So we have developed, if you would do this manually, it's a heck of a lot of effort. So what we've tried to do is to automate the records inventory process. We have developed a kind of an online survey tool that basically captures this information and some other important information that folks can log into the website, fill out the surveys. We're able to compile that information and kind of develop your retention schedule and application in a very automated fashion. Takes a lot of the burden on you. and a lot of the burden on the folks in the trenches off of them as well. The other thing too is, again, in terms of kind of conducting the survey, you may not need to, but I kind of recommend you do this. And that is, once you do either the kind of the paper or online survey tool that folks can fill out and identify the records and the various other aspects of what you're looking for, I would recommend going out and sitting down and talking to the folks to go over the answers to those inventory forms, and also really kind of dig down in terms of the retention period, right? So they may give you, let me give you an example, right? So employment applications has a legal minimum requirement of 2 years. You may get back a response that we're going to keep the employment applications for 15 years. Again, this is just a hypothetical. But it's good to sit down and talk to the person filling out the form and asking them why it is 15 years that we need to keep this, because that has ramifications, a whole host of ramifications. There very, very well may be a very good and valid reason why we're keeping those employment applications for 15 years. Fine. But you can have that discussion with them to figure out whether or not that's a good time. Also, it's a chance for you to sit down and say, hey, is there anything else? Is there anything else that we should include? Are there any particular problems that you're having in terms of dealing with this different types of records or kind of dealing with electronic records? It's a good way for you to get buy-in to your stakeholders and let them know that they've got a seat at the table and they're invested in this process. Because ultimately, you're going to need their help in coming up and actually doing the disposition and maintaining this as a living, breathing organism. It's not a one-shot deal. We will need their help in making sure that the retention schedules are being followed. Okay. Anything else so far? Interesting enough, literally before this presentation, I just got a message from one of my partners that he had a public entity and he had an issue with regard to freedom of information. Just sheer coincidence, right? So in addition to conducting the records inventory in order to develop the application to then get rid of records, it also provides kind of a ready list of documents that you have that can help you respond to freedom of information requests. All right, you know whether you've got it, you know how long you have it, and that that could kind of speed those things along. Also, and heavens forbid, if you're involved in a disaster, it will be helpful in determining what records may have been lost. And it's not just kind of natural disasters like tornado or fire. We had one instance in which a sprinkler system had a malfunction and basically flooded one of the records rooms. And so because we had a records inventory, we knew what was in those boxes and how long those records went back. So that was helpful in kind of deconstructing what we had. Okay. So now we have gone out and either by written or online survey tool, we have canvassed the library to figure out what records they have. We've talked to them about, what's the volume of those records they're accumulating annually and how long, or what's the volume in total, and talked about how long, both from a legal and then also from kind of a business or operational perspective, how long we need to keep those. Great, so what do we do next? We compile all that information into a records retention schedule. And the schedule is necessary because it will be included in your application for authority to dispose of local records that you will submit to the Local Records Commission. Okay, and I'll talk about that in the context of the application right now. So again, you've got essentially you've got the retention schedule, and then there's kind of a cover letter that's got to be signed by someone at the library saying, here's, this is accurate. And so basically the records listed on the application can be disposed of after a couple of things, criteria met. Number one, the individual retention period is complete, right? So for those employment applications after the minimum required 2 years. Also, if there's, assuming that there's no local, state, or federal audit requirements that have been satisfied, right? So if you're, if an auditor's coming out and finding out if we've engaged in lawful employment practices, right? So if there's none, you can go ahead and get rid of it. And kind of on a similar vein, if there's no litigation pending or is reasonably anticipated. And the records listed on the certificate and the application certificate can be disposed of 60 days, cannot be disposed of 60 days prior to the intended destruction date. So you've got a little window there before you submit the application and get it approved before you can get rid of it. So it takes a little bit of time, and also it takes a little time for the commission to go through your applications and to sign off on it. Okay? Again, keep in mind a couple things. Number one, the Local Records Act does not have retention periods. Though there may be retention periods elsewhere, and those are the ones that are kind of driving your retention periods for the application. So you've got to look to Illinois and federal record keeping requirements in developing your retention schedule and your application. Okay, another selfless plug. We have compiled basically all the record keeping requirements, state and federal laws, for Illinois, and then all federal record keeping requirements. So if you got a question, be more than happy to, if you're asking me how long you need to keep an employment application, I could tell you, or whatever kind of other records you've got. So that's a ready resource that we have maintained and we continue to update. All right, enough of the infomercial. So here's the other thing. So you take the application, you submit it to the Local Records Commission, and simply because the Local Records Commission approves that application doesn't necessarily give you a get out of jail card if you get it wrong, right? So again, kind of my employment application as one example. If you decide we want to keep the employment application for 1 year, and heavens forbid if the Local Records Commission approves that, and you only keep those records for 1 year, because of the federal law requires you to keep it for 2 years, just because the Local Records Commission said it was okay to keep it for 1 year, you still have made some problems with the federal records. And also, sometimes you may have situations where the law is constantly changing in terms of record keeping requirements. They may go up, they may go down, and for whatever reason, you may not necessarily have updated your application, your retention schedule, so there may be a conflict, or a record may fall within either one class or another class having different retention periods. Long story short is basically the longer retention period will take precedence over the shorter one. Okay.
So I have a question.
Yes.
And apologize if you've already answered it, but when we talk about disposing of records, are there any guidelines that dictate the manner in which you, especially I guess with sensitive information, social security numbers, so forth, does it actually give you guidelines you must follow in terms of how you dispose of records, or is it really just a case of the best practices you should have for obvious reasons?
Yeah, in Illinois, other than records containing social security numbers, there are no specific requirements about how to dispose of sensitive information. So there's a couple parts to that. Number one, with regard to information containing social security records, if they are in physical form, those have to be shredded in a manner that you cannot essentially recreate that hard copy record. If they are in a digital format, either, let's say, the disk or the drives have to be either wiped clean or holes punched out in the disk such that you cannot grab that information or recreate that information. I say that in terms of Illinois. You see in a number of other states that have very specific requirements Oregon is one, Massachusetts is one, that has very specific requirements about how to dispose of sensitive information. I bring that up because I kind of see where things are going, right? In Illinois, it would be nice if we were ahead of the curve, but a lot of times, particularly on this, we're following. But we now know that there's other states out there that have these requirements, and they're becoming more important because of the data breach issues. We also have an Attorney General here in Illinois that is very much interested in data privacy, data security, and has sponsored a number of different bills, legislation around that issue. So my point in saying this is that we know a lot of states have done it, and I would anticipate that Illinois would follow in a similar fashion. So yes, no, but be on the lookout, because that's coming. And quite frankly, I hope it does, because there's no reason why we should be taking less than stringent efforts to get rid of that information in a way that we're not compromising the information. So I think that's a very good thing. So good question. Any other thoughts or questions?
Question that came in online. This is just speaking specifically to the inventory survey tool and those list of regulations. I mean, is that something you put on your website, or something that a individual interested pays for that service, or how does that work? Somebody asked.
Yeah, so kind of going back to the infomercial, but so basically the way in which that is typically done is we make that service, the survey tool, available as part of our engagement, and then also the way in which the statutes and regulations are also made available. I mean, typically, the way in which we're very flexible in terms of there's different needs, different clients, different needs rather. So we're flexible in terms of what's going to work best for you all. But kind of what we've seen in the past is basically put those survey tools up, let folks use the surveys, follow the surveys. We'll take those surveys, compile the retention schedules, and then use the statutory and regulatory records keeping requirements and kind of do a checksum to the recommended retention periods to eventually produce a schedule. But again, that's, there's different ways we can kind of address that issue. Okay. So here's kind of the cover letter or cover page of the application, and those requirements that I talked about a little bit before. Those are right here, down in the kind of the middle of the application. So a couple things, and this is kind of the guts of the application. And each of the applications will be assigned a number that's in the upper right-hand corner, and a couple other things in terms of what's on that application, and kind of also goes to Joe's question about kind of how we're going to do this. So number one, we've got here. Application for authority to dispose of local records and records disposal certificates. So that is the record name, record title, dates, volumes, annual accumulations, arrangements, and then the recommendations. So here, kind of breaking this down into its own individual parts. So kind of, again, going back to here and kind of cover each one of these. So number one, right, so here, item 3, agreements, contracts, and leases. And basically that is a record series. And a record series is basically similar types of documents that are going to be retained and disposed of in a similar fashion, right? So again, we can kind of provide you a laundry list of what those general kind of record classes that you probably are generating in the ordinary course of your operations. Here, kind of what's the earliest date of the record series, and there's kind of 2 ways to do this. And let me just kind of pause. So, and really it kind of depends on what the function of that records. So for instance, like you have the first one, the example here is 1976 through a date, and the second is 1976 to 2014. That's a defined period of time. So For the first instance is that's something you've got ongoing records that you're continuing to accumulate, right? So employment applications would be a good example of that. The second example, so you've got kind of a discrete concrete date bracketed. A lot of times that involves records that you have a program that was in existence for some period of time and you've now discontinued, right? So take, for example, you've got a summer reading program for young kids that you may have sponsored 2 years ago, but for whatever reason you're no longer offering that, in years subsequent. So that would be this kind of the second set of an example. And believe it or not, the Local Records Commission wants to know that much detail. So as you're doing the records inventory, you need to ask the folks. Yes?
One question that came in online, in the inventory, do you have to specifically mention the format, like whether paper or electronic, for example?
Yeah, great question. So kind of flipping back, and I don't know what page it is for those folks online. So if you go to, I think it's 23, is it 23 on the deck? So here's the application. And interestingly enough, this is what you have to fill out. So they do not ask for the application purposes, whether it's hard copy or electronic. Having said that, right, absolutely a crucial information point for you to know as you're conducting the records inventory. Here's the reason why. And you need to know, pause for just a second, you need to know how those records are being maintained currently and how those records have been maintained historically. Because here's the reason why you need to know that information and where that, particularly if it's electronic records or hard copy records, where that information is. So fast forward, you get your application, you get your certificate of destruction. Great, now we can get rid of those employment applications. The next question is, where are they? Are they in hard copy record sitting somewhere down in the basement? Are they, some of them sitting out in Iron Mountain? Or they're, we've digitized them, they're sitting on this server or that server, so you need to know that information. So great question and great kind of lessons learned on that. Sorry. Okay. So again, here's kind of the total volume of the records here. I think a lot of people are a little freaked out because it's kind of tough to estimate, particularly whenever you got records strewn all over the place. Kind of rule of thumb, if you've got less than a quarter cubic feet of records, I usually just use negligible, and that's going to be sufficient for the Local Records Commission. A box size, generally about 1 cubic foot, and here's some other kind of estimate, ways to estimate, volumes. So rule of thumb, realistically, the Local Records Commission, they want you to have a good faith estimate, but it's not exact science, and I think they realize that. Again, ultimately, you're going to have to find out what is the annual accumulation, how much of these records you're generating, each year, and that's going to be identified in the annual accumulation part of your application. And again, something you want to ask in your records inventory and kind of has that changed historically over time. How's the record series maintained? Again, we've talked about this in a number of different ways. It could be alphabetical, numerical, alphanumerical, or some other ways, right? By project or some other fashion. All right, we've got about 20 minutes. In terms of the minimum retention periods, right? There are a number of different ways to define a retention period. So a couple things. Number one, you can have for a set period of time, so retain for 5 years and then dispose of, right? And an example of that would be OSHA documents, right? Those have to be maintained for 5 years. So for OSHA records, you can say 5 years. There may be other historical records that you want to keep permanently. There may be records that you don't know what the value of those records are and how long we need to keep those, those may be maintained indefinitely. And I'll get the difference between permanently and indefinitely. Alternatively, the retention period may be triggered after the occurrence of a certain event. So for example, for a contract, you want to keep those contract records and the records around a negotiation performance of those records for the length of that contract is in effect and being performed plus a certain period of time. For employment or personnel files, similarly, you want to keep those records for as long as that employee is employed by the library plus some period of time. So there's a number of different types of record or retention periods. Okay. And essentially, and we kind of talked about this a little bit, but I kind of want to drill down this. So really, the retention periods, as exciting as they are really based upon 4 values: an administrative value, fiscal value, legal value, and historical or archival value. So for administrative value, so basically, a record may have a value while the transaction is being performed. A policy is in place or something else. And then once that transaction is completed, once that employee is gone, once that contract has been performed, then the value, the administrative value of that document becomes less and less over time. However, there are certain types of records that truly have an administrative value that exceeds the transaction itself. So a good example of that is rules, regulations, policies, and procedures. Right? So you may have an HR policy, an employment policy that is superseded or is amended over time, but historically having that policy procedure you may want to use or need sometime in the future, right? So if you've got an employment issue that comes up 3 or 4 years ago, you may need to go back and look at that, what was the policy at that time, so that would be something that you want to keep permanently. And again, this is kind of an art to kind of figure in all these different values. You kind of look at all of them and kind of come up with a retention period at the end of the day. So there's a legal value, and we've kind of touched on this, right? So again, you may have contracts that you want to keep for as long as the contract is required, and then you've got all those federal and state record-keeping obligations that you need to factor into in coming up with your recommended retention period. Similarly, there may be a fiscal value for those records. You may enter into an agreement with a vendor. That vendor is providing services to you, and you are paying for those vendor services. So keeping records about the contract, performance, and your payment, that has a physical value for those records for the time period in which you're engaged in that vendor relationship and that vendor is providing services to you. And then finally, research, historical, or archival value. So this is really, let me give you an example, right? So we've got pictures of the old Glen Ellen Library, right, that they've maintained for historical purposes. Those are the types of records that you want to keep in perpetuity, for permanent, because that's just something that you want to have long term. So, questions so far? Okay. So it's kind of additional purposes, additional considerations, all right? So what I've used permanent and indefinite. They're 2 different terms, and not to get too deep in the weeds with you. But permanent really means for archival or retention period, that means forever. Indefinite, right, is not permanent, but it basically means that we don't know how long this record we're going to need. So we're going to assign an indefinite retention period that we're going to keep that for some period of time. We just don't know how long. The important part of that is you need to revisit how long we're keeping those records. You just can't have records indefinite. Basically, you're saying we're going to put a placeholder on that. So for instance, like for litigation records, we don't know how long that litigation is going to be ongoing, how long it's going to take. We're going to assign a retention period, an indefinite retention period, and once that litigation is terminated, then we can assign a specific retention period to that. Just an example, and there's other ones. Okay, and we'll talk, and we kind of talked a little bit about this going forward in the past, and let me just kind of pause specifically with regard to electronic records. And there is no single retention period that applies to emails, instant messages, Sims, BlackBerry, or anything else. Or, social media posts. Basically, as I kind of alluded to before, it's really the content of those emails and instant message that really is going to define a couple things. Number one, again, is it a public record? And if it is a public record, how long we need to keep that electronic communication. And again, it's based upon all the various values that we were talking about before. And generally, an electronic message will generally be the same retention period as that message if it was in hard copy form. Now, some communications are created primarily for, kind of short-term value. And understanding, and there's a number of different types of what I would call transitory messages. And in fact, that's recognized as a transitory message about, hey, scheduling a meeting. There's something that doesn't have, long-term value. There's a discrete short period of time in which that has a value. So, electronic communications that are created primarily communicate information of a short-term value, right? Those might follow under a transitory message series, and we'll give kind of the list of that, but you can assign a retention period for transitory messages for a very short period of time. And if you look at kind of your email consumption and email retention, you're going to have a lot of this. So having transitory messages as part of your application will save you a lot of money and a lot of angst later on. Okay, disposing of public records. So now we've got the application, we submitted it to the local records commission, they've approved the application. Now we have the instance where we've got those employment applications from 2000 to 2010. What do we do to get rid of them, right? We create a local records disposal certificate, we submit it to the local records commission, and they will give you approval to dispose of those specific records that you've listed on the certificate. And we were talking a little bit before about before the presentations. I think most agencies do that annually at a specific time period, and whatever time period works best for you, make it a set period of time each year. I've also kind of seen folks do it anywhere between 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. A little over 3 years may you kind of lose traction and lose momentum. So I would caution about anything longer than 3 years. Here's kind of the working draft of a disposal record certificate, and then here's kind of a snapshot of it. And again, it kind of goes back. You've got the application number, again, kind of tying back to the application. What are your record series? How long those records that you're disposing, and then the amount of information that you're getting rid of. All that information has to be on the certificate, and eventually you'll get a approval from the local records commission, and here's what it looks like. There are a number of different resources out there, not only the Local Records Act, but there's actually two parts of the Illinois Administrative Code. One deals with the Downstate Local Records Commission. Another one is the Cook County Records Commission that I've cited on this slide. And another very good resource is the Secretary of State's website on records management, and it's listed here. One final thing, and I didn't include this, but one thing is absolutely critical, right, is once you've kind of put this, two things. You know, this is truly a living, breathing organism that you have to devote resources not only to develop, but also to maintain. The feed and maintenance of the program is just as important as it is to the creation of the program. And part of that feed and maintenance is obviously doing training to your employees, understanding and telling them that, hey, yes, we do have a procedure to get rid of our local records, and here's how you do it. I think that gives folks comfort and also kind of gives them an understanding of how important this is for the library and you know, in order to continue good operations of the library. That's it for my kind of prepared remarks. I know there's kind of been some questions throughout the presentation. I greatly appreciate those. So if there's any other questions, I'll field those now. Joe?
Yeah, Bruce, a couple questions from online.
Yeah.
The first, so here's the question. Our application is 8 years old and doesn't reflect some records,
Yeah.
which we now keep,
Yep.
which should probably be included. So a question about the process. How do we go about getting our application updated
Yeah.
to reflect
So
that?
I mean, that's quite frankly, that's an easy one, right? So basically, it's taking your existing application, refreshing it, adding those new categories of records that you're creating now that were not on the old application, and then making the application to the local records commission. That's an easy fix.
And kind of related, are there any penalties for not doing a record inventory update? If we haven't had the time or the staff to do this, for us, it's been about 4 years.
Yeah. Great question, right? And the answer to that is no. However, there are penalties if you do dispose of records and you have not done an updated schedule and an updated application and getting it approved by the local records commission. So if you've got records that you have that's not on your application, you haven't gotten approval, and you go ahead and dispose of them, that may create some problems for you.
Well, any other questions here in Burr Ridge or from anyone else online?
Oh,
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. And so my contact information is on the last page of the deck. Feel free, if you think of some additional questions, either later today or email or call me, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, well, no more questions online, and one more question, I guess, here in Burr Ridge. Go ahead.
Related to the first question that you asked from online, if your application or certificate is outdated because of things changing, you to clarify how you do that form, does somebody from the state have to? That's how we did it.
Right.
Somebody from the state came and sat with us.
Yeah.
You can't just do it yourself.
Yeah, so
Can you restate that question?
Yeah, so the question was, in the event that you do have a situation where you've got new records that you're generating that are not reflected in the application, do you need to have somebody from the state to kind of help you through that process? There is a resource from the state archivist, and the name escapes me for the moment. But anyway, they will, and I'll send it to you, Joe, and you can send it out. But they are a resource that you can ask for them to come out and help you do your records inventory. That's one approach. It may take, I mean, obviously there's a lot of different state agencies and local agencies. So for them to do it, it may take you a little while to get on their list and for them to come out and kind of help you. Alternatively, what you might want to do is say, look, we've got some records that we need to include, and kind of have a discussion with them, so you kind of do the legwork and basically present it to them and kind of have them help you, but not necessarily do as much legwork. That may speed the process along, or essentially you can kind of do it yourself. I mean, there's no requirement that you need to leverage those resources. Those resources are out there if you want them. I mean, the key is getting your application and submitting it to the local records commission. That's the requirement. How that comes to fruition before then, it's kind of up to you.
And I guess maybe we'll call this the last question from online. If you have a records, two more questions, sorry.
Sure.
In regards to emails or cell phone messages, if we're using our own personal email service or personal cell phone, would this all still apply?
Yeah, and that's kind of a Hillary Clinton type of question, right? So, and that's tough, right? I mean, if you go back to the definition of what is, go back here. Right? Wow, quick recap, right? If you go back and look at what is the definition of a public record, it really doesn't, it's not tied into kind of the system or the format. So unfortunately, if you are creating an email as part of the library's business on your cell phone or on your, your device, it may very well be a public record, which obviously creates a whole bunch of different issues. The nice thing about that is, particularly with regard to email, and if you think about, basically you have to preserve one public record. And essentially that record not necessarily doesn't exist on your BlackBerry or your iPhone. Rather, it probably exists in the library server. So that's really not too much of an issue. The problem really becomes of one of instant messages, where those instant messages are not through the library servers, but it's going through your telephone carrier. That may be more of an issue, and that's kind of more of a tricky issue. So, and we can spend probably another 45 minutes on instant messages and email. So.
All right, and then we'll call this the final question. If you have a records disposal certificate from several years ago, but those records just haven't been destroyed yet, do you need to reapply before you actually destroy those?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, technically, if you have a record certificate that says you have these records that can be disposed of, you've kind of got the approval of the local records commission, and you can. Query whether or not you should do some additional steps just to get kind of cover things. I think that might be a factor of, how long those records, how old that certificate was issued. So.
All right, well, it is just a couple minutes before 11, so I think we will wrap up. Let me thank you, Bruce, again, for coming out and talking about this topic with our members. Thank you to all who came here to Burr Ridge and those watching online. As a reminder, this recording will be available within about a week's time, so watch the Rails website for that. And as I said earlier, if you're watching online, need a copy of the handouts, I'm happy to send that to you as an attachment. So thank you again, Bruce, and everybody enjoy your day.
Thank you all.